Hi. All right. So today we are going to do a lesson just on Georgia, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So the last Southern colony to be found was Georgia. One day, a member of Parliament in London, England, named James Oglethorpe, had a brainstorm. Oglethorpe had noticed that English jails were overflowing with debtors. So, a debtor is somebody who basically has borrowed money and has to pay it back. Usually they have to pay it back at a higher price than they borrowed it for. So, for example, if they borrowed $100, it might have 10% interest. So that means that they would have to pay that additional 10%. So instead of paying $100, they would owe the person they borrowed it from $110. But if you can't pay that money back, then there would be consequences for it. So in England during this time, people were put in jail called a debtors prison if they were unable to pay their debts. Sometimes these jailed debtors owed a little amount of money and sometimes they owed a lot. Oglethorpe had noticed that these debtors, even those who owed a relatively small amount of money, were often left to die in jail without any way of paying back the money they owed, right? Because if you're in jail, you can't make any money in there. So it was like they had a consequence that they could never escape from. So their families might try and raise money to pay back their debts, but oftentimes these were people who were in a position that they had to borrow the money in the first place because they were struggling with money to begin with. Oglethorpe's idea was unique, and it was to set up a new colony in North America where these debtors would actually be given a second chance. They would be given land so they could begin a new life. They could work to pay back the money they owed, and their debt would be forgiven. So, this was an opportunity in his mind to bring colonists over, right? Because you need people to settle the land to really claim the land. You can't just say it's mine. If you have nobody on it, then somebody else can come and take it more easily, right? So you really need people there working the land, establishing colonies. So his idea was like, a lot of these people that are in these prisons aren't bad people. They're just people that are financially struggling and poor. So if we bring them over, they could become colonists, have a new life, start off fresh, and also kind of relieve some of the pressure in the prisons because the prisons were full of prisoners that had to be fed and, taken care of. Not very well, but taken care of nonetheless. All right, let me continue on to the next slide. Sorry, this part is a little new here. Okay. So here you can see Georgia is the southernmost colony. So far we've learned about Virginia, which you can see up there, Maryland, right, which is the smaller one up above it, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. So we are kind of wrapping up the southern colonies right now. In 1732, the then King George II liked this idea. He gave Oglethorpe a charter saying that he could take a band of debtors from England to the area of land between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. So remember, Florida is that most southern state, and that was owned by Spain. The British Parliament supported this venture by giving Oglethorpe money and ships to make the journey. Upon reaching this new land, Oglethorpe named it Georgia after his royal majesty, King George. Kings just expected new lands to be named after them. Georgia was even larger back then than the state of Georgia is today. It actually included much of present day Alabama and Mississippi, so that was quite a nice piece of land King George gave to James Oglethorpe. However, even though sending debtors to the New World seemed like a brilliant plan to Oglethorpe and the king, it was actually difficult to persuade many debtors to leave their families and homeland and sail 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean to a place where they might not be welcomed with open arms. So their concern was okay, it's risky travel, right? Sailing by ship for 3,000 miles, landing in an area that you really don't know what you're going to get, right? At this point, there's tales of unfriendly Native Americans and deaths and struggle and disease, right? So they're kind of not so sure about that. And they would have to be leaving the area that they pretty much probably have been born and raised in and have family there. Once they arrived, the debtors would have to build their own homes as well as gather, hunt, and grow their own food. Many debtors preferred to serve their time in jail in England rather than face the unknown world. Some might say beggars can't be choosers, which is one of our sayings, right? So that saying beggars can't be choosers, meaning like, you don't really have a whole lot. You're stuck in this jail probably for the rest of your life. I'm offering you an opportunity. You shouldn't be picky about it, right? So that's kind of what that phrase means. Beggars can't be choosers. In all, about 100 debtors did agree to go on the journey to North America. They began the laborious task of helping to turn Georgia into a colony. So here is a picture of all of the kings and queens of the time that you have kind of read and heard about so far. Oops. All right. As soon as he arrived in Georgia, Oglethorpe met with the leader of the Yamacraw, a group of Native Americans in the region. Chief Tomachichi and the Yamacraw were willing to trade with the English and allow them to settle there. Oglethorpe worked hard to establish alliances with the Yamacraw and even invited some of them to visit England. Oglethorpe and his band of debtors developed the first settlement in Georgia, named Savannah. Now, this was a pretty smart move, right? And I think, when you think about Oglethorpe, this is a man who clearly believes in second chances and relationships and opportunity. So it was probably pretty wise of him to try and create a peaceful agreement with the local Native American tribe, especially after, all the difficulties that some of these other colonies have faced. So Savannah, you can see down there, it's right along, pretty close to the coast there. Of course, King George had another motive for sending settlers to Georgia besides helping debtors start a new life. As you can see on the map, Georgia is located between the Carolinas and what was then known as Spanish Florida. At this point, the British had not established any official colonies to the south of South Carolina. So, this was a perfect way to protect the colonies from the Spanish. Georgia served as a buffer zone to separate English colonies from the Spanish colonies. This would also allow the colonists to keep an eye on Spanish ambitions for growth in North America. So, just below Georgia, you really enter into Florida. And so, Georgia was established to kind of keep eyes on what was going on in Florida to see what the Spanish were up to, if they had any expansions in mind. And it also provided what they're calling a buffer, kind of like an area that kind of protects North and South Carolina, which are already established at this point. King George did not realize that the Spanish had already claimed the very area that he had in mind. It wasn't long before there was an armed confrontation between the Spanish and the British. As time went by, more and more settlers arrived in Georgia. Some of them did not get along with the native people as well as Oglethorpe and his followers had. The Spanish continued to stake their claim to the land, and buccaneers often attacked vital trade ships. So Spain is kind of like, hey, that's our land. You can call it whatever you want, but that's ours. And so they were pretty protective of the land that Georgia was. This new colony, the last one to be created, suffered its fair share of problems in the early days. whereas few debtors would agree to come and settle in Georgia. Many poor Europeans from other countries began to arrive and establish farms in this colony. They came primarily from Ireland and Germany. Um, Georgian farmers liked the idea of plantation farming, as it had proven successful in other southern colonies. However, the colonists soon found farming to be a back-breaking job and insisted that they needed help. Although it was first decided that Georgia would be a slave-free colony, the introduction of slavery slowly began. So, one of the things I haven't had an opportunity to really talk about is this, slavery component that's happening in these southern colonies. And hopefully, through your reading, you've come to understand that because they were growing these large cash crops, rice, indigo, tobacco, um, they were establishing these huge plantations, right? So these aren't just farms, these are huge areas that are being worked for the production of sending off these cash crops. And to do that, you had to have a ton of people working those jobs. There wasn't the kind of machinery that we have now that can make it move really quickly and, cut down on the actual physical labor. And to make that crop profitable, you needed tons of workers that basically didn't work for any money, or at least they felt like if they paid them, then they would lose too much of their earnings. So even though there were colonies that were kind of like, yeah, we don't really, believe in slavery, such as Georgia, because of what they were trying to do with the land and how they were trying to create an economy for their colony, bringing in money, they felt like it was essential and necessary to have slaves work that land because they couldn't get enough of the even poorer Europeans to do that kind of work. Before long, Georgia became a colony identified with plantation life and the heavy use of enslaved laborers. Within 100 years of being established, the state of Georgia had more plantations than any other state in the South and the second largest number of enslaved Africans, second only to Virginia. So, even with good intentions, unfortunately, Georgia also becomes a slave state. And I want to just remind you, these are early colonies, right? And as history moves on and we get to a place, the Civil War, right, after states have really been established, it does take some time for the practice of enslaving people to do labor. It does take some time to really change that course of our history. All right, until next time, bye.